It's time for the Rose Chat Podcast, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the world's most beloved flower, the rose. Join award-winning gardeners Chris Van Cleef and Teresa Byington as they chat with rose lovers and experts from around the globe. With each episode, you'll gain valuable knowledge and insights to achieve the rose garden you've always dreamed of. Listen now as we explore the world of roses.
Try Haven brand soil conditioners, providing generations of gardeners with a truly all-natural alternative to chemical fertilizers with their line of composted manure and alfalfa teas. Easy to brew and use on all indoor and outdoor plants. Find them online at manuretea.com.
Hey friends, you're in for a treat today. Michael Marriott is with me, and he's going to take us through the calendar year and share about growing roses in every season. So hey Michael, welcome back to Rose Chat.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Lovely to talk to you again.
Oh, it is great to talk to you. You know, I love the quote that says, anyone who thinks that gardening begins in spring and ends in fall is missing the best part of the whole year, for gardening begins in January with a dream. Now, it is a special part, but all the seasons have their specialty. And I'll tell you that my word of the year is focus. So, Michael, take us through the seasons and help us focus on what each season has to offer us as we enjoy and care for our roses. And since spring is just around the corner, well, let's start there.
Okay. Yeah, well, spring is in many ways the most exciting time. I think it's when you're full of promise, full of energy, ready to get out into the garden. You've been not be able to do much all over winter. Here in the UK, we can still carry on doing a certain amount, but in colder climates, you were just saying earlier on that it's been really cold and lots of snow, so that makes it a bit tricky. But in spring, everything is getting going, and you can really start getting excited about it. So I think one of the lovely things that people don't appreciate about roses actually is the spring colour of the young shoots. As I sit here in my house in Shropshire in the UK, I'm looking at a wonderful old rambler called Adelaide d'Orléans. And it's got beautiful little red shoots already on it, about 2 inches long. And even from my window, I can see them, lovely bright red colour. And then there's other varieties which are particularly brightly coloured as well. And one of the very, very best is Lady Emma Hamilton. The young shoots on that are really fantastically dark, brilliant red. And it stays on there for 2-3 months actually, and it doesn't really fade. Even the mature leaves are quite dark. And a few years ago, we had wallflowers planted, the very dark crimson wallflower planted next to Lady Emma Hamilton, and the combination of the leaf colour of the Lady Emma with the flowers of the wallflowers was absolutely superb. It looked really good. And when you've pruned all your roses and you can look across them, and each variety is a slightly different colour, and so you get a beautiful effect with all the different colours shooting through.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much color to be had. One of the things we're having to retrain people, especially people new to roses, is that red color that you talk about, that is a good thing, because in our country, we've had to deal with rose rosette, and that also is an odd red color. And so basil shoots and that sort of thing, especially to someone new to growing roses, are like, oh, is this the good thing or is this the bad thing? So that red color can be a little bit scary. So but it is so wonderful to look out and see those fresh new leaves for sure.
Yeah, luckily we never got we haven't got rose rosette over here, and I hope it never comes. But I have a feeling that there was a huge amount of panic about it, wasn't there, in the States, and quite rightly too. But I wonder how many were misidentifications, as you said, because they saw the bright red shoots on their roses and immediately drew the conclusion that it was rose rosette rather than just normal, healthy young growth on roses.
Oh, I'm sure you're absolutely right. That it's great to be forewarned, but sometimes that leads to panic. But I have not seen very much of it in my garden. I know in some areas of the country, it is prevalent, but I've seen a little, enough to know that we do need to be careful. But we've not had, it hasn't run through our garden or anything like that. And and I get roses all over the country, so it's going to happen, but not very much at all. So lucky there.
Good. It's a bit like suckers, isn't it, on roses? People sometimes they'll see beautiful young shoots coming from the base, and they don't recognize it, and they think it's a sucker from the rootstock. But in fact, I think suckers are fairly rare, and when roses are growing really beautifully strongly in the spring and sending up lovely strong shoots from the base, that's a really good sign. So first of all, assume it's a strong shoot from the base of the actual variety rather than the sucker. Don't be too hasty to cut those beautiful young shoots out.
I think your phrase of don't be too hasty. I think we just do need to give things time. Even with Rose Rosette, you have some time. It's not going to take over, your whole garden. You can give it time and get some help in identification. So we don't want to make any rash moves with a precious rose that we love.
No, absolutely not. No. And then, of course, in spring, I suppose it's late spring, early summer, some of the very early flowering varieties or species will start blooming. And the one that probably one of the very earliest of the lot is Canary Bird. Are you able to grow Canary Bird in your part of the country?
I've never heard anyone mention that one, so I'm not sure that we can.
All right, it's a species rose. It belongs to Rosa xanthina, comes from China, and it's just the most beautiful yellow color, really rich yellow. And there's quite a few yellow species, things like Hugonis and Cantabrigiensis and things like that. I'm not sure they'll be hardy in your part of the world, but certainly I would guess hardy to zone 7 or something like that. But they are absolutely fantastic and do flower very, 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 very early in the season. They're big shrubs. They'll grow quite easily 6 foot by 6 foot or even more. I've seen a Hugonis, which was pretty huge, really. And I'm a great lover of the species roses. You don't often see them around the place but they're wonderful. You don't need to do anything to them. That's the great thing about them. You plant them, and they're generally tough as old boots. And you certainly shouldn't go pruning them, because pruning them ruins their shape. So make sure when you choose a spot for them, there's plenty of space to reach their full size. Okay, they only flower once, but then that doesn't matter, because then they produce a beautiful crop of hips in the autumn, or in the fall, should I say. And then some of them have a wonderful fall color as well. So, yeah, well worth considering. And say Canary Bird, Hugonis, Cantabrigiensis, they're all very, very beautiful yellow species. And then the other yellow, very early flowering rose, of course, is Banksia. Mm-hmm. Can you grow Banksia in your part of the world?
We do.
Oh, do you?
I do not have it, but I see it. Oh, it's so exciting to see it, because it covers a wall like no other, and that color for spring is just perfect.
Absolutely, yeah. So tiny, tiny little flowers, very double. There's 4 different sorts. There's the one you see all the time, the Banksia lutea. There's the Banksia, which is a double white form. There's the Banksia normalis, which is a single white one and just smells absolutely deliciously of violets. And then there's the Banksia lutescens, which has single yellow flowers. And then, of course, the other one that's related to that is the Fortuniana, which is the one that's used commonly as a rootstock. Mm-hmm. I think, especially down in the southeast of the States. And I think people who show roses favor it because it encourages really strong growth.
Yes, most of the roses that I see on Fortuniana rootstock, they're taller than I am. So they're very tall. I've not tried it. I'm not. My garden is a bit crowded right now. So and I know the rootstock likes to fan out under the ground, so it could get a little crowded under there. But boy, some beautiful roses are grown on the rootstock for sure.
Oh, really? We don't have that over here. The only rootstock is used over here is something called Banksia, which is a bit like a dog rose, just little single white flowers. I remember I think one of the most magnificent roses I've ever seen was at the Alhambra Gardens in Granada in Spain, and the Banksia. This Banksia lutea was growing up a sort of 60-foot cypress tree, and it got right to the top. And it was, when I was there, it was just at its best. It's absolutely in full flower and just looked absolutely magnificent. Mm-hmm. And isn't that the biggest rose in the world? Is it in Texas?
Yes.
A Banksia that covers, was it an acre or something? I can't remember now.
Or maybe it's Arizona. Maybe is it Tombstone, Arizona? It's someplace where you think more cowboy than you do rose. I think maybe the largest Banksia is maybe it's Tombstone.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yes, I must make a pilgrimage to it one day and
yes,
see it in situ. You do see. You said that Banksia is incredibly vigorous and covers a wall, which is quite right. But sometimes you see it actually, and I've seen this in California and also in parts of Japan as well, where it's actually really quite small. I mean, only sort of a few feet tall and across, but so absolutely covered in flowers. And I've always wondered how they do it. And I guess what it is that they've been grown under really hard conditions, so there's hardly any new growth. So it's almost like, treating it like a bonsai, being really tough with it, but then it just flowers really, really well. I must find out the secret one day.
Well, I have a rose in my garden called Ghislaine de Félagon. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but Ghislaine, last year was her third, possibly fourth year in my garden. And so I decided to grow her as a climber, and she has literally covered my potting shed, and it is absolutely stunning. But a good friend of mine in Virginia says, "Oh, I never thought to grow her as a climber. I always just prune her back and she's a shrub for me." So maybe it's as simple as just pruning it back every year like I do a hydrangea, but not Welschenblau. That's one of the first ones to bloom in my garden. But Ghislaine de Félagon is just huge here, the way I have her on the trellises, and yet some people grow her as a shrub. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion, isn't there, about varieties that are shrubs and in one climate or in one garden, and climbers in another climate or garden. Mm-hmm. I remember many years ago, because a lot of the Austin roses can be grown both as shrubs as climbers, and it's something that we promoted a lot, but it actually confuses quite a lot of people, because how can a rose be both a shrub and a climber? And I remember I got an email from some very angry Russians who said a shrub rose can't be a climber. It's got to be a shrub rose. But of course, the reality is it all depends very much on climate, and so things like the hybrid musks, Cornelia and Penelope and Buff Beauty especially. In this climate, they're very much grown as shrub roses, maybe 5 or 6 foot tall and across. But you go across to the west coast of America, and they're really big climbers, aren't they? Yes. They'll grow up 15, 20 feet tall up into trees. And it's also how you prune them. So, if it's accepted that you should prune a certain variety, and you do that every year, then yes, you can just keep it as a big shrub. But then if you let it go, then it can easily become a climber. So it's a can full of worms, I think is the phrase, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Now, do you grow over there? Do you have Welschenblau?
Yeah.
It's gorgeous for me. I have it scampering up a tree that has some dead limbs, and it's just gorgeous. And it's usually the first to bloom in my garden. Yeah, it's one of the very first to bloom. And I have two of them actually, but one of them is in a place where only my neighbors get to see it. So I have to go over there to see it. But just scampering and just, requires no care whatsoever, but it's going to be the most beautiful display of violet color. Just fabulous. So
there's it's a group of 3 or 4, isn't it, of them? There's Veilchenblau, there's blue magenta. Well, Veilchenblau is the palest of the lot. There's blue magenta, which is darker. There's violet, and there's rosemary viol, and they're all sort of the beautiful dark shades of purple, quite small flowers. And the interesting thing about them, actually, they've got virtually no thorns at all. So that's the slight challenge of them, is that actually in growing up trees, that because they haven't got thorns to hang on. That's what thorns are for. They hang on to your clothes and your skin, but they also they're to hang on to branches so they don't get blown out. So that's the only sort of slightly challenging thing. Is that Veilchenblau, it will get blown out unless you sort of tie it in. Do you tie yours in, or is it?
Yes, it's started on a trellis, so it's got 6 feet of trellis. So as it keeps moving, we keep dealing with that. But it's anchored at least for several feet.
I remember seeing at Mottisfont Abbey, which is one of the foremost gardens in the UK, to see the old roses and also climbers and ramblers. And designed by Graham Thomas. There on a central pergola arrangement, they've got one of the dark purple ones. They've got Violette planted next to, I think it's Debutante, and the colour, which is it's a lovely pink, is just absolutely mid-pure pink, and the combination of the two, the purple Violette and the pure pink Debutante, is just absolutely superb. One of the best combinations you can ever imagine.
I think of this time that's coming out of spring and heading into summer as the fireworks and fragrance stage of my garden. Since I have a lot of the old ones, and I have some climbers, and then everything is fresh and blooming. It's almost more than your eyes can and your olfactory senses can take in. But it's just such a special time. Yes, absolutely. And so I'm particularly keen on fragrance in roses, and I always encourage people to smell them as much as possible and to choose varieties that are as fragrant as possible. I think it's always a bit disappointing if you've got a beautiful rose in front of you and then you put your nose to it and there's just no smell there at all. So try and choose varieties that are as fragrant as possible. And often I think people don't know that behind orchids, roses there's more variety of completely different fragrance types in roses than any other plant apart from the orchids. And sometimes it's very difficult to identify different fragrances, but then it doesn't matter, just appreciate for what it is, because the fragrance in roses is very, very special. Have this magical ability to calm you down, but at the same time raise your spirits. So it's even if you think, oh yes, I know what that rose smells like, it's still worth sticking your nose into it and appreciating it, and not just give it a quick sniff and then walk away, but really just draw it in and really appreciate it to the full. And then if there's somebody with you there, then share it with that other person as well. Fragrance is a magical quality of so many different plants in the garden, and especially roses. Especially before COVID, I took a lot of bouquets to the nursing home. Oh, yeah. And it was always heartwarming to take something in, whether it was roses or lilacs, or even a bouquet that had maybe sage and thyme in it, and just how the conversation started. The memories that started coming out. And, even for people there who didn't typically even say anything, very quiet. But all of a sudden, the fragrance of the flowers just triggered conversation and stories. And I think that you say, take your time to enjoy it. And if COVID has taught me anything, it's to appreciate details and not to always be scampering about, and which is very easy for me to do and get a lot done. And but thus my word of the year, focus, just to take some time and to focus and enjoy the beauty that's around us. So it's very important.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, yeah, you've got to appreciate what's around you. You just never know what's around the corner, do you?
No, you don't. You don't.
No.
So we had talked a little bit about, this was now that we've moved into summer, it's a good time just to take note of the roses that are doing well, don't you think?
Yes, I'm a great believer in looking critically at all the plants in your gardens, and just making sure that they're pulling their weight. Some plants or some roses will be absolutely superb. They'll flower like mad and they'll stay free of any problems at all, and they'll die and by dying I mean they don't look ugly once the flowers go over. They'll die very gracefully after they finish flowering, whereas others, they're not flowering very well. They're really subject to disease, whatever it is, and pests make a beeline for them. So it's important to assess each of the plants in your garden critically, and again that takes time, but it's excuse me, it's something you can do with what you were just saying about appreciating your plants. So walk around and look at each plant carefully, appreciate if it's looking absolutely superb. But if it's not looking good, if there's a problem there, maybe it's just looking superb, but it's just a plant in the wrong place. It's not looking good where it is because it clashes with its neighbour, or it's overwhelming its neighbour, or maybe it's been overwhelmed by its neighbour. And so very important to, I think, look very critically at your garden. And if at all possible, the time to make changes is straight away.
Yes.
It's so easy to say, oh, yes, that's a rubbish plant there. It doesn't look very nice. I'll move it this winter. And of course, come winter, you've either forgotten about it or I'll give it one more chance. I'll give it another year. Maybe it's not so bad as it was. but that's disastrous. So the thing to do, if you can at all, then dig it up straight away, or dig its neighbour up straight away, or whatever. Make the change straight away. One of the very, very best gardens in all of the UK is one not too far from where I live. It's called Woollerton Old Hall.
Oh, yes.
And you've been there, have you?
No, I have not, but the pictures I've enjoyed so much.
Yeah, so it's on Instagram as
Yes.
Woollerton Old Hall. And it is really one of the very best gardens in the country. And their secret of success, or at least a very important part of their secret of success, so they walk around, the owners, John and Leslie Jenkins, they walk around every evening with a glass of wine in their hand and look critically at everything, and looking for the beautiful things, but also what could be improved. And if it can be improved, then they'll take action, and very often they'll take action straight away to improve things. And their garden is really very magical. So if anybody can come across to the UK, then do try and go to Woollerton Old Hall. It is absolutely wonderful. And there's other very good gardens not far from there as well.
My thoughts on removing things in the garden has changed. When I was a young gardener, I would go to more heroics, I would say, to save a plant or a shrub. But now the garden's filling up, but my rose list is still growing. My plant list is still growing. So shovel pruning can be your very best friend to make room for more. And I've often heard people say, well, when's the best time to to take something out, and I'm thinking, when the shovel is close by, because as you say, you often don't get back to it. And so you know it at that moment, or you might change your mind later thinking, oh, I saw a beautiful picture of it, I'll just leave it. But yeah, no, there's just no time like the present on that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that phrase, shovel prune. I think it's the most beautiful, wonderful phrase, and I'm trying my hardest to introduce it into the English language over here. I think a few people will start using it. Every talk that I give over here, presentation or whatever, I encourage people to use it. It describes it very nicely.
Yes, it certainly does. And I think for us, we deal with some pretty brutal conditions in the summer, whether it be Japanese beetles or drought. We can have a very rainy spring in early summer, but then we might not have any rain for weeks. And so I'm looking for plants that are particularly attractive to Japanese beetles, thinking, and then also plants that can make it through those hard times. So we want, especially if you have a large garden, you want everyone to work well in all of the adversity that's going to come in the gardening year. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for too, is who's particularly bothered by a certain condition that we really can't do much about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, luckily we don't have Japanese beetle over here. We're very lucky. The worst pest we have really is aphid. We don't really have thrips or anything like that either. So count ourselves as very lucky from that point of view. And this probably doesn't apply to Japanese beetle, but I'm a great believer in not doing anything to try and control those artificially by using sprays or whatever. And it's easy for me to say that because, as I say, we don't have any really horrible things like Japanese beetle. But in the 40-odd years that I've been growing roses, I've never sprayed any of my roses at home with anything at all. And I do that by choosing really good, tough, healthy varieties in the first place, and mixing up the roses with everything else in the garden. So I encourage as many of the beneficial insects to come into the garden and deal with the pests themselves. So that works very well in the UK, but I can see that it would be more tricky in your climate.
It is a little tricky.
Yeah.
Nothing that I've ever known of anyone to do as far as sprays or anything for Japanese beetles. I don't spray them at all, but has worked. You either just, we drown them here. That's what we do. But we were talking about earlier, a few minutes ago, about just choices for your garden. And I think, oftentimes in a magazine or a catalog, we fall in love with the rose. But I think the times that we can visit other gardens in our growing zone and seeing what's doing well there can certainly help us prevent us from making some big mistakes. I mean, I'm all about taking chances and having something that you love, or it has a wonderful story, and giving it a chance. But often it is so wonderful to be in a garden that's not too far from me and to see something that's just going great. So not only assessing our own gardens, but assessing the gardens around us can be very helpful.
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. I think also the important thing to assess though is and something I go on a lot about. I mentioned it earlier on, is how roses die. So how do the petals get stuck on if there's a bit of dampness or rain? Do the petals get stuck together and become a horrible brown mess? I mean, if you're keen on deadheading, which I think actually is quite a pleasurable occupation to do, go around and picking off the dead heads, then it doesn't matter. But some varieties drop their petals very, very cleanly, and others refuse to do so. And then if you do go around other gardens, just do they spray, or do they just leave them to do their own thing? So it's some just on a practical note, it's something important to consider.
Well, I think we've taken care of summer, but let's move to what we call fall.
Yeah.
And I much prefer the way the British use autumn. Fall is not my favorite. It's something that I have to work at a little bit harder to enjoy. So it does help to hear it called autumn. So talk to us a little bit about roses in autumn.
Well, I think that's the time actually when you get the most beautiful flowers. And I'm sure it must be true in your climate where it's so hot during the summer, but it's also true in our climate. And I think it's just because the sun is not quite so strong. It's not such a glaring bright light. And so the colors are very beautiful. And for the repeat flowering roses, then you can often get a fantastic show of blooms on the roses. And also it's a chance to get a different group of plants to associate with them. I always think that because there's no true blue roses, it's great to introduce blue into the color scheme with your roses. And so you have the lots of autumn flowering plants, things like the different asters, there's monk and little Carlo and things like that, which I just think are so beautiful. And then, of course, you've got campanulas and delphiniums and things like that, and geraniums as well, some of the blue, I'm talking about the hardy geraniums, not the pelargoniums, which are the house plants. And so, yeah, it's great to get blue into the color scheme there, and there's some wonderful blue autumn flowering plants you can associate. One of the ones that I'm always bang on about, it's not just perennials. See, it's not just perennials. People always think about, it must be perennials and roses, but in fact, biennials, of course, there's some wonderful biennials around, things like foxgloves. And the other ones is annuals. There's lots of very hideous annuals around the place, overbred annuals, which just, to me, just leave me completely cold. They're just, I get very cross because they're just introduced on the basis of novelty. And, they're bigger or they're shorter, or the flowers are 10 times bigger than the original species or something. But are they beautiful? Often absolutely not. They're really as ugly as sin. So I won't go on about those. But instead, then I'll concentrate on one of my very favourite annuals, which is called Phacelia, which is spelled Phacelia. And there's 2-3 different species. The one that's most common is called Tenacityfolia. And it's actually native to North America. And it's the most beautiful sort of lilac-y, purpley blue colour. And you can almost sow it at any time and it'll flower really quite quickly. It wouldn't be hardy in your climate. It's hardy down to about -5 centigrade, which I guess is what, mid-20s or something like that. And lovely little fragrance, and it's incredibly attractive to all the bees and other insects in the garden. So it's a great one to plant in with your roses to try and attract in the beneficial insects to help control nasty pests. And because it's an annual, the root system isn't too invasive. So one of the problems with growing perennials, especially, and biennials with roses, is they can be very invasive. So some of the geraniums and Nepetas, Six Hills Giant, and Alchemilla moth, things like that, they very quickly spread around and they grow right around the base of the rose, and they'll suck out all the goodness and moisture out of the ground and leave very little for the rose. So it's very important that you shouldn't have anything growing too close to rose. But the good thing about the annuals, and that includes Phacelia, is it has a fairly small root system. So even if it grows right around the base, it won't harm the rose very much. So it'll self-seed itself around the place, and which looks absolutely beautiful. But then if it does become a bit over enthusiastic in its self-seeding, then it's the easiest thing to pull up. So do look at some of the annuals. Another one, the classic one, is Cosmos, of course. Again, there's some there's some truly hideous cosmos around. They've ruined a lot of them, but the pure white tall one is just so beautiful and goes on flowering for a very long time. And then there's the shorter ones like Love in the Mist, Nigella as well, which look very pretty around the front of roses. So yeah, autumn is a wonderful colour for roses, for a wonderful season for roses, and also I think because it's not quite so hot, then you often get better fragrance as well. So it's carry on putting your nose into roses and smelling them as much as possible. And then the other good thing about autumn is some variety, the once flowering varieties, will be producing beautiful hips. And we're told endlessly we should be deadheading our roses, we should be deadheading everything in the garden. But actually, it's a good idea sometimes not to deadhead things and just see what happens, because some roses will produce just the most wonderful crop of hips in the autumn. So Bonica, if you see a Bonica plant that hasn't been deadheaded, then it's covered in the most wonderful round red hips that will last for months on end.
The two roses in my garden that have the most amazing hips is a climber that I have. It's a David Austin, the Generous Gardener. And then I have a lot of different rugosas. And rugosas, you look at it and it looks like a huge cherry tree. They're just filled with these big, beautiful, round hips. But on your Instagram feed, I see so many of the old varieties that you have, and they have such unusual shapes. And, it's almost like you want to plant them for the hips. They're so beautiful. Oh,
absolutely. Yeah, people don't really sort of regard hips very much, but there's huge variety there. And one thing is huge variety of different color. Some of them will stay yellow, others will go orange, then to orangey red and bright red, and others are going to brown and then even black. So the Scots roses have black hips, all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So some are absolutely tiny, sort of about half an inch across, whereas others are like big cherry tomatoes. And then some are rounded, some are oval, some are flask shaped, some are all spiny, like Roxburghii is all spiny, a bit like a chestnut. And then some will last a very short time. Rosa sericea, the hips of that flowers very, very early in the season, but then the hips drop off very quickly. Then the rugosas and some of the Chinese species, they'll last probably through until October, November time, something like that, and then they'll all start shriveling. But there's others like the Generous Gardener you mentioned, which will last way into winter. Well, it does in this kind of, I'm not sure about in your climate, but will last way into winter, and even looking really good now. We've got a couple of varieties of ground cover type roses one's called Grouse, the other one's Partridge. I'm not sure they're available in the States. But their hips look absolutely superb now, and they'll last right through until March or even April.
One thing I've noticed, I'll cut a few just to have laying around because they're so beautiful, but they turn dark and they get so hard. You talk about protecting the seeds inside. They get hard. It's like concrete. I can't believe how they go from this luscious looking cherry to this hard seed pod. Those seeds are very well protected in there.
They are. And a few years ago, we hosted the family Christmas party, and I went out and cut some stalks of the hips on Kifskate, the huge Great Big Rambler Kifskate, which will grow up 60, 70 feet up into trees. And they look like sparklers, just absolutely beautiful, really lovely. So a lot of the Ramblers produce very good hips. Francis E. Lester is one of my favorites. Every flower turns into a little orangey hip that lasts a long time.
I actually have that one.
Oh, do you?
He's very sweet.
It's an American variety, isn't it?
Yes. It's very sweet, very sweet. It blooms very early. It's usually not the first, but it does bloom early, and then those sweet. Ghislaine de Filigon that I mentioned, it has sweet little hips too, similar,
Does
just
it?
little bouquets of hips,
Okay. Yeah.
really sweet. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the thing to remember from that is don't be too hasty in deadheading everything. So things like generous gardener that does repeat flower, and maybe deadhead some flowers, but leave others and just see what happens. And do that to a few varieties in the garden. And I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised how many will produce really beautiful hips.
I do that with the rugosas. I do want them to bloom a little bit more, just because if I've got a bouquet of roses and most of the roses in the bouquet are not very fragrant, then you can sneak in a little one rugosa bloom. It's a game changer for the whole bouquet and the whole room, actually. So I don't completely deadhead them, but I do deadhead them some to get more blooms. But for the most part, I do want them to make the hips.
Yeah, very good. And of course, the great thing about that, it's food for the birds. Mm-hmm. And other critters in the garden. So, well worth keeping.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're moving into winter. So, do you guys prune in winter, or do you wait and prune in early spring?
No, we've all our pruning is done now. So, I always very much recommend it should be done by the end of February. And actually, I think I always, rather jokingly, I always say Christmas is a good time to do it, because you've been stuck in the house all day long and getting all very hot and bothered and getting no fresh air at all. So it's a perfect time to go out into the garden and prune a few roses and maybe get rid of a bit of frustration at the same time. But yeah, for us over Christmas. And by the end of February, because I already hear some varieties, as I mentioned Adelaide d'Orléans earlier on, it's already got some quite long shoots on it. And so if you delay pruning too much, then you're likely to start knocking off those beautiful young shoots. And then you'll get fewer flowers, or you get delayed flowering as a result. And also, I think it's easy to get distracted by those young shoots. When you prune, you should, you see a beautiful, oh no, I can't cut that beautiful young shoot off, it's looking so good. Whereas if you'd pruned it earlier on, then you wouldn't be distracted by it, and I think you'd get better results at the end of it. And I know with you, it's a slightly different story. I think, do you go by when the forsythia blooms? Is that what you prune by?
Well, we start when winters were colder, and we definitely, things have changed a bit here. So when winters were colder, we waited till the ground was frozen, our roses were dormant, and we would take, like a shrub rose, not our ramblers, not our climbers. They're treated very differently, but just our shrub roses, we would trim them about a third, especially if they've gotten long arching canes that, need to be controlled, because we don't want them flapping around in the wind. So, by December, it was usually cold enough, and I would take about a third. And then when the forsythia blooms, then we would get serious with the shrubs and thin them out, take them down farther, and that sort of thing. Many years it was take them down to the ground, because, much of it had died above ground. So that's not, we're just having to, at least in my garden, I'm having to rethink that. I actually had a few blooms with bees buzzing on them in December. Yeah. So we had an extremely warm, so, there's always, we have to balance if we're going to get really, really cold, kind of, it's a chancy situation, because you don't want to prune and have things start to grow, and then it gets really cold, 10 below zero, and then everything gets nipped, and it's not good for the plant. So right now it's a little different. I'll tell you that 2 years ago, it's so different in my garden that 2 years ago, I decided my container grown roses, at least one of them, I would just leave out on the deck. I did. It was actually Bathsheba, and she did great all winter. And she's now, last summer I put her in the ground, but she did great in a pot on my deck. I watched her all winter from the door. And then this winter, I've done the same thing, and I checked them often because they're right out our bedroom door on our deck. And I have 4 roses still in the container that I grew them in, and they're green. So we've gotten cold, and we've had a lot of snow, but we haven't gotten cold like we got cold 20 years ago. So things are just, we're having to change some of the care that we give. And there were years that I buried roses because it was cold and didn't have a place in the ground. And I buried them, or I brought them into the garage in pots. But, so far I have Lady of Shalott. I have the Lady Gardener. I have Quietness, and forget who else is out there. But they're right at the back brick wall, and they're green as can be. So It's just been a different winter. So I think to our listeners, I would say, the rules are not as hard and fast as they once were, at least for me, on when to do things. But I do believe that spring thing for us, waiting till the forsythia blooms, is spot on, because that does tell you that the ground has warmed up, well, at least to 50 degrees, they tell us. And so that, it still can get cold. It's still erratic. We've had, horrible freezes on Mother's Day. So, weather a little crazy, but that's still a good rule of thumb for us, and to do our pruning of shrubs and that sort of thing.
Yeah. You mentioned Lady of Shalott there, and that is such an amazing variety. We pruned our roses. I actually we did a pruning workshop here at home, and that was, I think, 2 weeks ago. And the Lady of Shalott was still trying to flower then. And the flowers are a little bit miserable, but it's such an amazing variety that it just goes on and on. But yes, I think that's the trouble with rose growing. It's full of these old rules that are actually completely out of date, and they were made up when the climate was very different, and also made up when most people wanted to grow roses for the show bench.
Yes.
Of course, growing roses for the show bench is a completely different thing from just growing beautiful roses in your garden.
Yes.
And it's just like anything that if you want to show anything, whether it's a dahlia or chrysanthemum or a leek or an onion or something like that, you do completely different things. You specialize, and you fertilize in a special way, and you prune in a different way, and all everything else. But if you just want to grow ordinary flowers or vegetables in your garden, the rules are much, much simpler. So it's unfortunate that a lot of those old rules about how to grow roses still is around today, and people still read about it and try and apply those rules, and then it all makes it terribly complicated. But really, growing roses is, as long as you choose a good, tough variety, that's the most important thing, and prepare the ground well before planting them. And growing a beautiful rose is just the easiest thing. It's just the most rewarding of all things to do, really.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. They are shrubs, and for the most part, and so often, people say, well, people get just, panicky about pruning, and there is simply no quick question about pruning, because like you say, a lot of the information that you find on the internet, or I always tell people, check the date. Always check the date. When was the video made? When was the information written? Because if it was written during, a time or for hybrid teas being shown, that is totally different from anything that you would need to do in a regular garden. And you need to know, is it a climber? Is it a rugosa? Is it, what kind of, what's the end result? But if it's a shrub rose, like so many of the roses today that we have access to, we trim them like shrubs. So, it's not particularly difficult. If it's dead, you remove it. If it's too tangled in the middle, you remove it. So those same principles, the general principles for shrubs and that kind of thing, apply. And we certainly don't have to panic about it. We do want to do a little shaping with climbers, and we don't want to prune them late because we want their blooms. And there are a few things that people need to know, but for the most part, I think we can cut back a lot of the information for sure.
I agree. Yeah, I've actually written a book, and which is going to be published on the 5th of May. and there's going to be a North American version as well as a European version. And so I've tried as much as possible to simplify pruning and everything else to do with roses, and also include in it my suggestions for best varieties for various locations in the garden. So yeah, look out for that. I think it should be a lovely book.
Oh, that's exciting. Anything that simplifies so that people can just enjoy. We want to be able to go out, walk in our gardens, cut flowers, bring them in, grow them with our children, our grandchildren. We just don't want to make it complicated. And there's something to enjoy, as we've been talking about, in every season. And there's just much to look at and experience. And we just don't want to overthink it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if I take pruning to its absolute simplest, if you just cut them down to about halfway, that's as complicated as it needs to be, really. And then maybe after a few years, cut out one or two of the old stems. But yeah, don't worry too much at all.
Well, I think you've set us up for a wonderful year in the rose garden and in the garden in general. But there's something else I want to talk about while I have you. You and Rosie are doing Todd tours. Is it Todd?
Yeah,
Todd
TOD. So it stands for Two Old Duffers.
So where did this idea come from?
Well, it was Rosie's idea in the first place. It was the winter of last year, I think. Winter of last year. And we thought, because everybody, was locked down, we weren't able to go out at all, and it was all getting a bit tedious, really. So we thought it would be lovely to organise some groups, because we both have very good contacts with owners and head gardeners and things like that around the country, and private gardens especially. So we were able to call them up and could we bring a small group of people along to take them around your garden, and most people were absolutely delighted to do so. So it was all, because COVID was very, very prevalent then. It was all very COVID friendly, so limited to 15 people. But one of the things is that Rosie and I would take them around, and sometimes with the owner or head gardener, and because we've been associated with gardening and horticulture for such a long time, we often see things that maybe the average person wouldn't see, and so share our thoughts on it. And actually, it's been tremendously popular, and so we've launched another, I think, 8 for this year, and all but one is sold out already, and they sell out really within, some of them within a few hours of us launching them, and actually one of them sold out before we actually launched it. So it's been really popular. So just one-day tours, visit 2 or 3 special gardens in that time, and people really, really love them. And it's been a great way, because we've only advertised on Instagram, so people might know each other through Instagram, but then they get a chance to actually meet each other in person and make new friends. And so, I think some wonderful new friendships have formed as a result.
Well, my mom always used to say, when a door closes, a window opens. And so COVID may have closed some doors, but many windows opened, and this is one of them. I cannot think of a better way to see a lovely UK garden than with the two of you, unless I'm seeing it with my daughter. But just a perfect way to get people together safely and experience these beautiful gardens that people have worked so hard on.
Yeah, and some of them are super special and super private as well. So we've been very privileged access to some of these gardens.
So where will our listeners find information about the Todd Gardens?
So if you go online and search for Todd Garden Tours, that's TOD Garden Tours, then you'll find it. Or it's part of my website. So if you look up Michael Marriott Rosarian, then you should find it. And then, as I say, the Todd Garden tours are part of that. But unfortunately, they're all sold out except for one.
Oh my goodness, it did take long. So, well, maybe there'll be time that you can add others yet this year. But I'm so glad it's going well.
Yeah, we might add 1-2 more actually yet. We'll see how it goes.
Great. Now, while we're on the subject of travel, aren't you going to be co-leading a tour in 2023? Is it with Paul Zimmerman?
That's right. Yeah, to Australia and New Zealand, and so people can either do Australia or New Zealand, or combine the two together and do Australia and New Zealand. And so it's in Australia. It'll be starting at Adelaide, seeing a few wonderful gardens around there, and traveling across to Melbourne, seeing gardens around there, Mornington Peninsula. And then going across to New Zealand and fantastic gardens in the North Island of New Zealand. So that should be a really special tour. So to look for that, you have to search for botanical tours. I think it is a website called Botanical Tours, which are based in Australia. And you'll see, and then if you search for roses, you should see it there. And say Paul Zimmerman and I will be leading them jointly.
Yes, I think Paul's got it on his website, which is paulzimmermanroses.com, I believe. So there's some things there about it too, so that'll get you started as well. Yeah,
it's something I must put on my website too, actually, one of these days. Just to, I'm retired, but I'm just so busy.
Well, I retired too. And within 2 weeks after my retirement, I thought, I'm going to travel and I'm going to do all these things and I'm going to garden more. Well, within 2 weeks, we were on lockdown. I think it was 15 days to flatten the curve at that stage. And so I did get to garden. I didn't get to travel for a while, but I did get to garden.
Yeah. Well, I've signed up to be chairman of the Historic Rose Group over here in the UK. So that's taking up quite a lot of my time. And of course, writing the book took up a lot of my time as well.
Yes.
So it's never ending, but it's all good fun. Everything to do with roses is great.
It is good fun. And speaking of good fun, friends, if you're not following Rosie and Michael on Instagram, please do. It's easy. If you're on Instagram, Michael Rosarian or Rosie Posey Irving. They're just a delight. There's information, garden gear shopping, recipes, what to do with what you grow. And always with the two of them, there's this friendly banter that you don't want to miss. So they're just a total delight.
Thank you.
It's just, it's that one thing that, it's almost like after you follow someone for a while and you're kind of into their week, if not everyday, weekly life and garden life, you just kind of feel like you're down the street. So it's an odd but wonderful thing.
It is. I think that Instagram is very special from that point of view, actually.
It is. It is. Well, Michael, this has been wonderful. Thanks so much for being with me today.
Well, it's been great. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Well, so fun. And friends, until next time, let's be on the lookout for signs of spring. Because even though it's a little cold out there today, spring is coming.
You've been listening to the Rose Chat podcast with Chris Van Cleve and Teresa Byington, expert rose gardeners who want to help you achieve the rose garden of your dreams. Don't miss an episode. Listen anytime on our website at rosechatpodcast.com or listen on the go via the Rose Chat app on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Share this podcast with your social networks and join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the hashtag RoseChat. Join us next time for another edition of the Rose Chat podcast. The Rose Chat podcast is a production of the Rose Chat Media Group, Birmingham, Alabama.